It's strange how one small sentence can cut deeper than years of silence. Imagine showing up to a family gathering, heart open, gift in hand, only to hear, "Wait outside, Mom, we'll let you know." That moment, as simple as it sounds, can feel like the world closing its door on you. Have you ever been in a room where love was supposed to live, yet somehow you were left standing in the hallway? Before we dive into this journey, I want you to pause with me for just a second. If you've ever felt overlooked or pushed aside, this story is going to echo loudly in your heart. And because so many of us share these untold moments, I'd love to know, when was the last time someone's words made you feel smaller than you truly are? Drop it in the comments, because your story matters here as much as mine. This is just the start of our conversation on dignity, belonging, and the hidden cracks inside family love. And if you're new here, now is the perfect moment to subscribe, not later, not tomorrow, because the upcoming chapters hold twists you won't want to miss, and you deserve to be here for all of them. The memory of that day still hangs in my chest like unfinished business. It began simply enough a Sunday, the kind of day families usually mark with laughter, meals, and catching up. I arrived at my son's house carrying a dish I had cooked early in the morning, something I thought everyone would enjoy. I remember feeling almost nervous, like a guest rather than a parent, which is a strange feeling to carry in your own child's home. The driveway was full of cars. For a second, I hesitated at the edge of the sidewalk, watching through the window as people moved around inside. I could hear faint music, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation. For a moment, I imagined the warmth waiting inside for me. I straightened my shoulders, balanced the dish carefully in my hands, and walked up to the door. The door opened, but not wide enough to step in. My daughter-in-law stood there. She didn't smile, didn't even look directly at me. Instead, she leaned slightly against the frame and said in a voice that was polite only on the surface, "Oh, you came. Could you wait a bit outside? We're still setting things up." Her words landed sharper than she probably intended. I froze, dish heavy in my hands. I looked past her shoulder and saw the table already set, glasses filled, people moving in and out of the kitchen. Nothing looked unfinished. For a moment, I wondered if I had arrived too early. I pulled out my phone to check the time. No, I was right on schedule. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Of course, I'll just wait here." She nodded quickly, almost relieved, and closed the door. The sound of the lock sliding into place hit me harder than the words had. I sat down on the porch step, careful not to spill the food I had worked on since sunrise. The air outside was cool, but the noise inside was warm and alive. I could hear laughter, forks hitting plates, someone telling a story. My body was outside, but my heart felt pressed against that door. Neighbors passed by on their afternoon walks. A couple waved politely, and I smiled back, pretending everything was fine. But inside I felt exposed, like the world could see me sitting there waiting for permission to join my own family. I thought about leaving, just standing up and walking back to my car, but the food on my lap anchored me. Minutes stretched. My back stiffened from sitting on the hard step. I shifted the dish from one knee to the other, wondering if anyone inside even knew I was out there. I imagined my son, maybe laughing, maybe clinking a glass with someone, completely unaware that I was just a few feet away, trying to steady my breath. Finally, the door opened again. My son appeared this time, smiling in the way that people smile when they're trying to smooth over something without addressing it. "Mom, you're here," he said, reaching for the dish in my lap. "Come on in, we've been waiting for you." The words rang false. If they had been waiting for me, I wouldn't have been sitting outside for half an hour. I stood up slowly, my legs a little stiff, and followed him inside. The warmth of the house hit me immediately, the smell of food, the buzz of conversation. But instead of feeling welcomed, I felt like an intruder stepping across a line. The living room was full. Some people glanced up when I entered, nodding politely before returning to their conversations. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes completely. I placed the dish on the counter, suddenly unsure if anyone would even eat it. My hands trembled slightly, so I tucked them into my pockets. I tried to blend into the rhythm of the evening, but every laugh around me seemed just out of reach. I caught fragments of conversation plans for vacations, work updates, jokes that everyone seemed to understand except me. I smiled when someone looked my way, but inside I was still sitting on that porch, wondering how a parent becomes a guest in her own child's home. At one point, I excused myself, and went to the bathroom just to breathe in silence. I stared at my reflection, noticing the way my shoulders sagged, the tightness around my mouth. I pressed my palms against the sink and told myself to hold it together. I didn't want anyone to see how much it hurt. When I returned, my dish had been placed on the sideboard untouched. People were serving themselves from the other plates, but mine sat there, lid still on, as if it were invisible. I stood nearby for a moment, hoping someone might ask about it. No one did. The night carried on like that, me drifting in and out of conversations, smiling when I was supposed to, nodding at stories I wasn't part of. By the time dessert was served, I felt hollow. I thought about how many times I had opened my own door wide for guests, making sure no one ever felt like an outsider. And now, in the one place I should have belonged, I was waiting on permission to step in. As I finally gathered my things to leave, my son hugged me at the door. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said. His words were kind, but they carried the weight of formality, like something you'd say to an acquaintance. I forced a smile, kissed his cheek, and walked back into the night. The dish was still full when I carried it back to my car. The ride home that night felt longer than it really was. Streetlights passed in measured intervals, but each one only seemed to highlight the weight pressing against my chest. The dish sat on the passenger seat beside me, unopened, its foil still intact. Every time I glanced at it, I was reminded of the silence around it at the table, how it had been ignored like an afterthought. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep my thoughts from spilling over, but they kept circling back to the same place. When did I stop being seen as family? And when did I start being treated as an inconvenience? When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flickered to life, casting a glow on the empty space around me. I carried the dish inside, setting it down on the kitchen counter. The house was still, the kind of silence that can feel peaceful on some days but suffocating on others. I opened the foil and stared at the food, now cold, untouched. I thought about tossing it out but couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I sat down at the table, placed a small serving on a plate, and ate alone. Each bite felt heavier than the last. That night, lying in bed, my mind replayed the moments on the porch, the locked door, the sound of laughter just beyond reach, my daughter-in-law's voice, flat and dismissive. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if maybe I had overreacted. Maybe she really had been busy setting up. Maybe she hadn't meant to shut me out. But the sting of being left outside for so long told another truth. I thought of my son, smiling as if nothing had happened, and wondered if he really hadn't known, or if he had chosen not to. That possibility hurt the most. The next morning, I tried to distract myself. I cleaned the kitchen, watered the plants, went for a walk. But the memory followed me, sitting in the back of my mind like a stone I couldn't shake. By afternoon, I found myself staring at my phone, debating whether to call my son. I picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. What would I even say? Why didn't you notice I was left outside? Do I not matter to your wife? The words felt too raw, too likely to push him away. I scrolled through our old photos instead. Birthdays, vacations, casual dinners where everyone looked happy. There was one picture of me holding my grandson when he was just a baby, my son smiling beside me. The warmth in his eyes back then felt like a different lifetime. I caught myself whispering, "Where did that version of us go?" My voice cracked in the empty room. That week, I kept my distance. No calls, no visits. I waited, almost hoping my son would notice the silence and reach out. But the phone stayed quiet. Days passed in a blur of routine. Grocery shopping, reading, small errands. On the outside, everything looked normal, but inside I was carrying questions I didn't know how to answer. The hardest moment came on Thursday, when a neighbor stopped by to return a dish I had lent her. She asked casually, "Did you have a nice time at your son's dinner?" I forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, it was lovely," I said. The words left a bitter taste in my mouth. I didn't want to explain what had really happened. Saying it out loud felt like it would make the wound deeper, more real. That night, I sat at my desk with a notebook open in front of me. I used to write little reflections for myself, but I hadn't in a while. I picked up the pen and wrote the date at the top of the page. Then the words came. I sat outside while my family laughed inside. The sentence stared back at me, blunt and unadorned. I wrote another line. I don't know if they even realized what they did, but I can't stop feeling like I don't belong. The more I wrote, the more the feelings spilled out, the loneliness, the confusion, the anger I was trying not to admit. By the time I put the pen down, pages were filled. Reading them back made my chest tighten, but it also felt like releasing something I had been carrying too long. Over the next few days, I kept returning to that notebook. Writing became a quiet refuge. Every entry helped me sort through the mess inside me. One evening I wrote, "Maybe it's not about that one night. Maybe it's about all the little moments that have been building up. The small comments, the times I felt left out but ignored it. This was just the one I couldn't push aside." That realization cut deeper than I expected. The porch moment wasn't isolated. It was the sharp point of something larger. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how often I had brushed things under the rug, convincing myself it wasn't worth stirring conflict. But each time I stayed silent, the gap between us grew wider. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to decide whether to confront my son or keep carrying this silence. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, imagining his responses, my own words, the possibility of it turning into an argument. Fear made me hesitate. What if speaking up pushed him further away? What if it confirmed what I already feared, that I wasn't as important in his life anymore? Still, another part of me whispered that if I didn't say something, I would only keep shrinking in their world until I disappeared altogether. By Sunday morning, the quiet of my house felt heavier than usual. The kettle whistled, the clock ticked, but the absence of my son's voice, my grandson's chatter, or even a casual check-in call gnawed at me. I had told myself all week that maybe he would notice the silence and reach out. He hadn't. That realization settled over me with a dull finality. Waiting for someone else to fix this wasn't working. If I wanted any chance of healing the distance, I would have to take the first step, no matter how uneasy it made me. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in hand, thumb hovering over his name. For a long time, I just stared at the screen, fighting the urge to put it back down. My heart beat faster, as if dialing my own son was some kind of test I wasn't ready for. Finally, I pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, casual and light, as if nothing had changed. "Hey, Mom, everything all right?" That simple greeting cracked something in me. I wanted to say yes, to fall into the rhythm of small talk, but the words that came out surprised even me. "No, not really." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause where you know the other person is choosing how much weight to give your words. "What do you mean?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Last weekend, at the dinner, I was left outside on the porch for almost 15 minutes. I could hear everyone laughing inside. It felt like I wasn't wanted there." My voice trembled despite my effort to keep it steady. He exhaled, a sound caught between surprise and discomfort. "Mom, I didn't know. I thought you came in with everyone else. I'm sorry." His apology landed, but it felt unfinished. "It wasn't just about standing outside," I said quietly. "It's how often I feel pushed aside lately. I'm more of an obligation than family." The silence that followed felt endless. I could almost picture him rubbing his forehead, trying to find the right response. Finally, he said, "I didn't realize you felt that way. I never meant for you to." I wanted to believe him. A part of me did. But another part still carried the sting of that night. "I know you love me," I said. "But love doesn't erase how I'm treated. I can't ignore it anymore." His voice softened. "I'll talk to her." I should have noticed. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I don't want to be a burden in your home. I just want to be part of it." We ended the call with an agreement to meet later in the week, all three of us together. Hanging up, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I had finally spoken the truth. Dread about how my daughter-in-law would react when faced with it. The days leading up to that dinner were tense. I replayed every possible scenario in my head, her brushing it off, her turning defensive, her pretending it never happened. Each possibility left me restless. Still, I knew silence wasn't an option anymore. When the evening came, I arrived at their house with a knot in my stomach. My grandson ran up to hug me at the door, his small arms wrapping around me with a warmth that cut through my nerves. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then my daughter-in-law appeared. She smiled politely, almost too politely, and motioned for me to come in. We sat at the table after dinner, the air charged with unspoken tension. My son cleared his throat. "We need to talk about what happened last week," he said, his eyes shifting between the two of us. My daughter-in-law's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" I took a breath. I was left outside while everyone was inside laughing. It may have been a mistake, but it hurt deeply. It made me feel like I didn't belong here. She blinked, then crossed her arms lightly. "I was busy getting things ready. I didn't mean to leave you out." I nodded. "I believe you didn't intend to, but intention doesn't erase impact." I sat there feeling invisible. And it wasn't the first time I felt overlooked. Her expression shifted a flicker of defensiveness, then something closer to unease. My son placed a hand on the table, steady but firm. "We need to do better," he said. "Mom deserves to feel included, not sidelined." The room went quiet. My daughter-in-law's eyes dropped to the table, and for a moment, I thought she might dismiss it. Instead, she let out a small sigh. "I didn't realize how it felt from your side," she admitted. "I should have been more mindful." It wasn't a sweeping apology, but it was a start. I nodded slowly. "I don't expect perfection. I just need honesty, respect, and space where I'm not treated like an outsider." The conversation lingered in that space, uncomfortable yet necessary. By the end of the night, nothing was magically fixed, but the air felt clearer. My son hugged me tightly before I left, whispering, "Thank you for telling me." Driving home, I realized the confrontation hadn't solved everything, but it had broken the silence that was threatening to consume us. I had spoken up, and in doing so, I reclaimed a piece of myself I hadn't realized I had been losing. The next morning, I woke up feeling both lighter and unsettled. The dinner conversation had shifted something, but it hadn't brought closure. Instead, it revealed how fragile the ties between us had become, and how much I had been depending on their approval to feel like I belonged. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for months. If they never changed, could I still be okay? That thought startled me. For so long, I had been focused on waiting for them to notice me, to treat me better, to invite me in wholeheartedly. But what if that never happened? Could I stand on my own, without letting their actions define my worth? The answer wasn't clear, but it pushed me toward a truth I couldn't ignore anymore. If I wanted peace, it had to begin with me. I got out of bed, made coffee, and sat with my notebook. I had bought it years ago with the idea of journaling, but had only ever written a few scattered pages. That morning, I opened it and began writing everything I had been holding inside. The porch moment, the laughter I overheard through the glass, the ache of being treated as an afterthought, the years of quiet sacrifices I had made for family. Words spilled out faster than I expected, as though once I started, they refused to stay locked away any longer. By the time I looked up, 2 hours had passed. My coffee had gone cold, but something inside me felt steadier. I realized writing wasn't just about venting. It was about reclaiming my story from being only a background character in someone else's household. Later that week, I signed up for a local community workshop on communication. It felt almost strange, sitting in a room of strangers and learning about assertiveness, boundaries, and listening skills. But each session made me see that my silence had been part of the problem. I had allowed things to slide, hoping patience alone would mend them. Now, I understood that patience without action turns into quiet resentment. Around the same time, I started volunteering at the library's children's reading program. At first, it was simply a way to fill the empty afternoons, but soon I noticed how different I felt walking out of those sessions. The children's laughter was genuine, unfiltered, and it reminded me of how much I still had to offer beyond being a grandmother. My voice mattered in those rooms. My presence mattered. These small steps began to add up. My life stopped orbiting entirely around my son's household. The hurt didn't vanish overnight, but it no longer had the power to define every day. I still visited, still spent time with my grandson, but now I walked in with a stronger sense of self. I wasn't there just hoping to be noticed. I was there choosing to share part of myself. One evening, after I read a story at the library, a woman from the group approached me. She said, "You have a way of holding attention. Have you ever thought about leading a workshop yourself?" I laughed, almost dismissing it. But later at home, the thought lingered. Could I turn my experiences into something that might help others? That night, I looked through the scribbled pages of my notebook. What I saw wasn't just pain. It was growth, lessons, realizations that others might relate to. The idea began to take shape. Instead of letting my daughter-in-law's dismissive moments define me, I could use my own story to guide people who felt invisible in their families, workplaces, or communities. The more I considered it, the clearer it became. I didn't just want to survive the silence I had felt on that porch. I wanted to transform it into something meaningful. And for the first time in a long while, I felt excited about what could come next. When I told my son I had started volunteering and attending workshops, his reaction surprised me. "That's great, Mom," he said genuinely. "You sound different these days, more confident." I smiled. "I feel different. I'm realizing I don't need to wait for people to make room for me. I can create my own." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm proud of you." Hearing those words meant a lot, but unlike before, they weren't the only thing holding me together. His recognition felt like a gift, not oxygen. In the weeks that followed, I kept writing, kept showing up at the library, and even started sharing my experiences with a small group of women I met through the workshop. We sat in a circle, trading stories of being overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. Each of us carried scars of being silenced in some way, but together, our voices grew stronger. It was in those circles that I realized the deeper truth. Belonging doesn't always come from family alone. Sometimes, it's built in unexpected places, with people who choose to listen, who see you for who you are rather than the role you play. The porch memory didn't vanish, but it no longer haunted me. Instead, it became a turning point, the moment that pushed me out of waiting and into living. I stopped measuring my value by how quickly someone opened a door for me. I started measuring it by how firmly I walked through the doors I opened for myself. A few months later, I noticed something unexpected happening. The more I invested in myself, the less I felt consumed by whether or not my daughter-in-law approved of me. It wasn't that the sting of old moments had disappeared completely, but they no longer controlled how I walked through each day. I felt sturdier, and with that sturdiness came curiosity about what else I could build. One afternoon, while sorting through the papers in my notebook, I realized I had filled nearly half of it with reflections, lessons, and even short stories about my experiences. Looking at those pages, I thought, maybe this isn't just for me. Maybe someone else out there feels exactly the way I did on that porch, and they need to hear they aren't alone. The idea made me nervous. Sharing my private thoughts meant opening myself up to judgment, but I also knew silence had cost me too much already. I began slowly. At first, I joined an online writing group where people posted essays and personal stories. I uploaded one of my pieces under a pseudonym, just to test the waters. The response was more encouraging than I could have imagined. Strangers left comments saying they felt seen, that my words captured what they couldn't express. Reading those reactions, I realized my story wasn't only about me. It reflected something bigger, something many people, especially women my age, were quietly enduring. Encouraged, I started attending local community events where speakers shared personal growth journeys. Sitting in those rooms, I thought about how much I had to give. I wasn't a polished presenter, but I had lived through years of being overlooked, and now I was finding ways to rise from that. That felt worth sharing. It was around this time that someone from the communication workshop approached me after a session. She said, "You have a gift for clarity. Have you ever thought about coaching?" The word caught me off guard. Coaching? I wasn't sure I fit that role. But she explained how life coaches often came from ordinary experiences, using their own challenges as tools to guide others. I couldn't shake the idea. For days, I turned it over in my head, weighing whether I had what it took. Then one morning, I researched certification programs. The process looked daunting: hours of training, assignments, practice sessions, but I felt something stir inside me. For the first time in years, I was excited about committing to something that was entirely my own. The coursework wasn't easy. There were evenings when I sat at my desk, staring at the material, wondering if I was out of my depth. But I reminded myself of how I once thought I couldn't rebuild my life after feeling invisible, and yet I had. Each completed module was proof that I was capable of more than I gave myself credit for. When I finished the certification, I cried not because of the paper, but because of the woman I had become along the way. The woman who had once stood outside on a porch, waiting for someone to invite her in, was now choosing to stand on her own and open doors for others. At first, I took on a few clients quietly. People referred to me through word of mouth. They were women navigating retirement, mothers adjusting to empty nests, or individuals struggling to find their identity after years of caring for others. In each session, I noticed a familiar theme. They felt overlooked, unheard, and unsure of where to go next. As I listened, I realized my pain had equipped me with empathy. I wasn't just offering strategies, I was holding space for them the way I once wished someone had done for me. The feedback was humbling. Clients told me they felt stronger, more capable, more hopeful after working with me. Each success story added fuel to a fire I hadn't known I carried. But I didn't want to stop there. I kept writing, shaping my notes into chapters, and soon those chapters began forming the outline of a book. The idea of publishing was intimidating, yet the thought of staying silent felt worse. I decided that even if only a handful of people read it, it would be worth it. The publishing process tested me in new ways. There were edits, rejections, and moments when I doubted whether my voice really mattered. But I kept thinking about that night on the porch, the night I realized what it felt like to be dismissed in my own family. If telling my story could prevent even one person from feeling that same kind of loneliness, then it was worth pushing forward. Months later, when the book finally came out, I held it in my hands and felt something shift deep inside me. It wasn't just paper and ink, it was proof that I had refused to disappear into the background of my own life. What stunned me most was the response. The book began to spread through online groups, women's circles, and eventually larger platforms. Messages poured in from people across the country, some even from overseas, telling me my words had given them strength to speak up in their own families, to start new projects, or to finally believe they mattered. As the book gained momentum, opportunities opened. I was invited to speak on podcasts, attend panel discussions, and host workshops. Each time I stepped onto a stage or in front of a camera, I remembered the woman I used to be, the one sitting quietly, hoping someone would ask her to join the conversation. Now, I was the one leading it. I knew then that the transformation wasn't just about finding love for myself or repairing one family dynamic. It was about showing that growth is possible at any age, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Looking back, I don't pretend everything is perfect with my daughter-in-law. We still have our differences, and there are days when the distance between us feels sharp. But the difference is, I no longer see her approval as the deciding factor in my happiness. I've built something larger than that, a life that feels whole, meaningful, and authentically mine. The porch memory will always remain, but it's no longer the defining image of my story. It's simply the moment that lit the path toward everything that came after. Not long after the book began gaining attention, I found myself receiving an unexpected message from someone I had met at one of the workshops months earlier. He had been attending a series of talks I had been giving, not as a client, but as someone quietly observing, intrigued by the stories I shared. His note was simple but warm, mentioning how much he admired the way I had transformed hardship into strength and how he hoped we could meet again. I hadn't thought about romance in years, not since the slow dissolution of my marriage, and yet reading his words stirred something unfamiliar, a spark that had been dormant. I hesitated at first, cautious after years of navigating family tensions and personal setbacks. The instinct to protect myself was strong, but so was the curiosity. We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, the kind with quiet corners and old wooden tables. Sitting across from him, I felt a strange sense of ease. Conversation flowed naturally, and I realized that sharing the journey I had undergone didn't feel like exposing weakness. It felt like an invitation to connection. He didn't rush me, and there was a gentleness in his laughter that reminded me of evenings spent reading by the window, absorbed in my own thoughts but yearning for companionship. Over the next few weeks, our meetings became routine, each one deepening the sense of trust and warmth between us. I shared stories from the book, and he shared his own past experiences, the challenges he had overcome and the quiet hopes he nurtured. What amazed me was the way he listened, not just hearing my words, but really absorbing them. That kind of attention was rare, and I found myself responding with authenticity I hadn't allowed in years. It was refreshing and terrifying at the same time, to open myself in a way I had once considered dangerous. As our bond strengthened, he suggested a getaway, a simple trip to the coast, somewhere quiet where we could focus on conversation and reflection. I hesitated again, considering the logistics and the emotional stakes, but something inside me pushed forward, urging me to step beyond the carefully built walls around my heart. I agreed, and we planned a short escape, careful not to overthink the implications. The trip became a turning point. Walking along the empty beaches at sunset, I realized how much I had craved connection, not just superficial interactions, but genuine understanding. He didn't try to solve my past or offer advice. He simply shared the space beside me. And in that silence, I recognized a freedom I hadn't felt in decades, the freedom to enjoy someone's company without expectation, without the weight of judgment, or the echo of past resentments. It wasn't long before I began imagining life differently. The cautious optimism I had cultivated during my coaching and writing journey now extended into personal life. I found myself considering possibilities I had once dismissed: shared mornings with laughter, quiet evenings with conversation, a partner who respected both my independence and my history. This wasn't a storybook fantasy. It was a real, tangible path unfolding in front of me, built on mutual respect and the kind of companionship I had silently yearned for. Returning from the coast, we continued to meet regularly, each encounter reinforcing the trust and affection growing between us. It felt different from the hurried, performative interactions of my past. There was patience, a kind of calm acceptance that allowed me to be fully present. In sharing both joys and vulnerabilities, I noticed a profound shift in my own perspective. The fear of being left out, of being dismissed, was no longer the compass guiding my choices. Instead, I was choosing experiences and relationships that nourished me. The culmination of this evolving relationship came when he suggested an extended escape, an opportunity to leave behind the familiar routines and responsibilities, even for a short while, to explore a small tropical island. At first, I laughed at the idea. It seemed impulsive, almost reckless, but a thrill ran through me at the thought of adventure. For years, I had lived cautiously, allowing the opinions and judgments of others to dictate my comfort. Now, I found myself embracing spontaneity, trusting both my instincts and the growing connection with this man. Arriving on the island, we were greeted by the quiet hum of nature and the gentle rhythm of waves. There were no schedules, no deadlines, just days unfolding organically, filled with sunrises, quiet swims, and conversations that lingered long into the evenings. In that environment, the layers of my past anxiety, family conflicts, and self-doubt seemed to lift. I felt lighter, more present, and more attuned to the simple pleasures of companionship and shared experiences. During one particular evening, as we watched the sun dip below the horizon, I realized how far I had come from the woman waiting outside the house years ago, uncertain if she would be included in the family's plans. I no longer needed anyone's validation to define my worth or my happiness. The porch that had once symbolized exclusion now felt like a distant memory, a reference point for the strength I had cultivated over time. I was no longer waiting to be let in. I was choosing to step forward and create my own spaces of joy and connection. As the days passed, our bond deepened. We explored hidden coves, sampled local food, and shared stories that ranged from laughter to quiet confessions. Each shared moment reinforced the realization that life could still surprise me, that meaningful relationships could emerge when least expected, and that personal growth and companionship were not mutually exclusive. Leaving the island, I carried a profound sense of possibility. The woman who had once been defined by waiting and uncertainty had emerged as someone capable of embracing joy, adventure, and intimacy on her own terms. The journey to this point had been winding and sometimes painful, but it was precisely those experiences that allowed me to appreciate the depth and authenticity of the connections I now had. The tropical escape wasn't just a romantic interlude. It was a testament to the resilience I had nurtured through writing, coaching, and self-discovery. I understood now that happiness wasn't contingent on approval or inclusion. It was cultivated through courage, curiosity, and the willingness to open oneself to both challenges and new opportunities. And as I reflect on that period, I feel a quiet pride, not in the romantic narrative itself, but in the transformation that allowed me to experience it fully. I had moved from waiting on a porch, uncertain of my place, to stepping confidently into experiences that affirmed my worth, autonomy, and capacity for joy. It was a chapter of life that affirmed the lessons I had written about and coached others through. That even in later years, new beginnings, growth, and unexpected love are not only possible, but richly rewarding. Even as life seemed to settle into a comfortable rhythm, I could feel a subtle undercurrent of tension creeping, almost like a quiet storm on the horizon. The mornings with coffee and conversation, the afternoons spent writing and coaching, and the occasional weekends away no longer felt as unchallenged as they once had. The balance I had worked so hard to achieve began to show cracks, not dramatic ones, but enough to stir unease. I had grown accustomed to steering my own path, making decisions with confidence, yet I now sensed the delicate interplay of expectations, unspoken demands, and personal ambitions beginning to weigh more heavily. It started with small things notes left in my writing studio reminding me of deadlines, subtle shifts in tone during phone calls with family members who had always been critical, and glimpses of frustration in my partner's expressions when our plans didn't align perfectly. I found myself overanalyzing, questioning whether I was imposing too much on the people I cared about, or if I was simply misreading cues that weren't meant to be worrying. For someone who had spent years navigating family rejection and emotional betrayals, the internal dialogue was relentless. One afternoon, I received a call from my daughter, her voice tight with emotion. She was asking questions about the upcoming family gathering, probing gently but persistently about my intentions. I sensed a lingering doubt in her tone, a shadow from the past when she had once excluded me from major decisions. I wanted to reassure her, to demonstrate that I was mindful of her comfort and feelings, yet I felt the familiar pang of vulnerability, the fear that no matter how carefully I acted, I might still be cast aside. At the same time, tensions began to emerge with my partner, though they were rooted not in malice, but in differing perspectives. What had started as playful banter about daily routines gradually shifted into deeper discussions about expectations, boundaries, and priorities. He had a natural tendency to assume a more fluid approach to time and planning, while I had honed precision and careful consideration from years of managing crises and family conflicts. These differences, though seemingly minor, sometimes flared into misunderstandings that required careful navigation. I recall one evening, sitting across from him at our usual cafe, as he quietly expressed his frustration about a scheduling conflict. It wasn't an argument, but a tension-laden dialogue that demanded both patience and empathy. I had learned to balance honesty with diplomacy, a skill honed from countless professional interactions and personal negotiations, but this felt different. This was not about winning a debate or persuading a client. This was about aligning hearts and minds without sacrificing individuality. The real challenge came when an unexpected event disrupted our carefully structured lives. A family emergency required my immediate attention, pulling me away from work, personal projects, and planned outings. The sudden demand was manageable, yet it stirred old anxieties about being indispensable and simultaneously invisible, a paradox I had wrestled with for decades. While my partner offered support, the strain was palpable, a reminder that no relationship, no matter how nurturing, exists in isolation from life's unpredictable tides. During this period, I also noticed subtle shifts in my professional life. Invitations to speak at workshops increased, and opportunities to expand my coaching practice presented themselves. While thrilling, these developments added pressure, demanding more of my time and emotional energy. I realized I had to make difficult choices, prioritize family, maintain intimacy with my partner, or pursue professional growth with undivided attention. Each option carried consequences, and none felt entirely free from compromise. In navigating these challenges, I drew on lessons from the past. I reflected on moments when I had felt excluded or underestimated, remembering the resilience I cultivated in those times. Rather than react impulsively, I focused on communication, open, honest, and patient dialogue with those involved. It became clear that acknowledging vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was a pathway to connection. I discovered that even in moments of stress, expressing needs and listening without judgment could transform potential conflict into collaboration. One particularly significant evening brought the culmination of these tensions into sharp relief. My partner and I were hosting a casual dinner with close friends and a few family members. At first, the gathering seemed normal, even lighthearted. But as conversations unfolded, subtle remarks and unintentional comments about my life choices began to surface. I felt a familiar stir of defensiveness, yet I paused, recalling the strategies I had developed over years of coaching others through conflict. I chose to respond with composure, acknowledging feelings without assigning blame, and steering the dialogue toward understanding. The outcome was remarkable, not because everyone agreed, but because there was space for genuine expression without judgment. My daughter voiced her concerns calmly. My partner shared his frustrations, and I articulated my perspective. The discussion, which could have devolved into discord, instead became a bridge for empathy and connection. I realized that challenges, whether from family dynamics, romantic relationships, or professional pressures, were inevitable. The difference lay in how I approached them, with mindfulness, clarity, and courage. By the end of that evening, a sense of equilibrium returned, though it was different from the effortless calm I had once experienced. This new balance required ongoing attention, conscious communication, and a willingness to embrace discomfort. I understood that life was not about avoiding tension, but about learning to navigate it gracefully, with self-awareness and mutual respect. The lessons of exclusion, rejection, and betrayal that had once shaped my approach to relationships were now tools for cultivating deeper, more resilient connections. In reflecting on these months, I recognized a profound truth. Growth and happiness are not linear. Even when surrounded by love, support, and opportunity, life will present moments that test patience, empathy, and self-confidence. The key lies in maintaining integrity, honoring personal boundaries, and embracing vulnerability as a strength rather than a liability. These experiences were not setbacks. They were catalysts for further evolution, shaping the way I approached family, romance, and professional life. Ultimately, Part 7 is a reminder that even after achieving what seems like stability and joy, challenges persist. But these challenges are opportunities in disguise, moments to practice resilience, communication, and self-trust. I learned that it is possible to hold love, ambition, and personal growth simultaneously, as long as one is willing to navigate the complexities with care, reflection, and courage. The morning after that evening lingered in my thoughts, like a heavy fog, each memory sharper than the last. I woke to silence in the house, a rare moment of calm that allowed the weight of recent events to settle fully. As I poured my coffee, I realized that what had started as a simple gathering had become a turning point. The subtle shifts in conversation, the unspoken tensions, and the careful navigation of emotions were all leading toward a confrontation I had sensed but avoided for months. I tried to shake off the apprehension, telling myself that I had handled previous conflicts with poise and thoughtfulness. Yet, an unshakable anticipation threaded through every moment. It was not fear, exactly, but a cautious awareness that change was inevitable. I reflected on my past experiences with family, the countless moments when decisions were made without my input, when my voice was sidelined and my intentions questioned. Those memories, though painful, had sharpened my understanding of human nature and given me tools for negotiation and emotional resilience. Later that day, a message arrived from my daughter. Her tone was measured, polite, but there was a tension underneath that words could not fully mask. She suggested we meet for lunch to clear the air. My mind raced, weighing every possible scenario. I wanted to approach it with openness, but the shadow of past betrayals made me cautious. I reminded myself that honesty and presence were my strongest allies, and that the only way forward was to confront the issues directly, without defensiveness or distraction. At the restaurant, the atmosphere was delicate, almost fragile. We exchanged tentative greetings, and for a moment, it felt like any ordinary lunch. But as soon as conversation shifted to family matters, the undercurrents became unmistakable. My daughter voiced concerns about my recent decisions, hinting that she felt excluded from choices that affected her life indirectly. She spoke with a mixture of curiosity, worry, and subtle frustration. I listened carefully, resisting the urge to defend or justify too quickly, and instead asked clarifying questions to understand the core of her unease. The conversation revealed deeper layers than I had anticipated. There were emotions buried under years of miscommunication, unspoken expectations, and the residue of old resentments. Each statement carried weight, and I felt the familiar sting of being underestimated, of having my contributions minimized or overlooked. Yet, amid the discomfort, I discovered openings for dialogue that were both sincere and constructive. I realized that acknowledging her feelings openly, without judgment or defensiveness, created space for genuine understanding. In the midst of the discussion, a seemingly small remark triggered a flood of emotion. She mentioned a family decision I had been only partially informed about, which had ramifications I had not fully considered. The realization hit me sharply. Despite my efforts to remain involved, I had been kept on the periphery. It was a painful reminder of patterns I had endured for years. However, instead of reacting with anger, I focused on clarifying my position, sharing my perspective, and explaining the reasoning behind my recent choices. This moment of transparency began to shift the tone, turning potential conflict into an opportunity for connection. After lunch, we walked together through a nearby park, the changing leaves and crisp air offering a natural buffer against tension. The scenery provided a quiet space to process and reflect. She shared memories of childhood, moments that revealed both warmth and distance, and I responded by recalling shared experiences with honesty and vulnerability. It became clear that while past misunderstandings had created distance, they did not have to define our relationship moving forward. I sensed a willingness in her to rebuild trust, and in myself, a commitment to approach every interaction with empathy and clarity. Meanwhile, the broader family dynamics continued to exert subtle pressure. My partner noticed the strain and gently reminded me to pace myself, highlighting the importance of balancing emotional labor with personal well-being. I took his advice to heart, realizing that navigating family complexity required both attentiveness and self-care. Over the next few days, I engaged in thoughtful reflection, writing notes, and strategizing ways to maintain constructive dialogue without sacrificing my own boundaries or emotional equilibrium. A critical turning point arrived during a family meeting called later that week. My daughter, siblings, and I convened in the living room, each of us bringing our perspectives, concerns, and hopes to the table. From the outset, the air was charged, but I approached the gathering with calm intent. I acknowledged the history of misunderstandings, admitted where I had erred, and emphasized a commitment to mutual respect and clarity moving forward. This approach gradually shifted the tone from tension to collaboration. By the end of the meeting, we had mapped out clear expectations, redefined boundaries, and established a process for open communication. It was not a perfect resolution, but a meaningful step toward rebuilding trust and connection. I felt a sense of accomplishment, not because I had won, but because the conversation had transformed potential conflict into constructive dialogue. It reinforced a lesson I had long known, that even when relationships are strained, proactive communication, empathy, and courage can foster reconciliation. The experience of Part 8 illuminated the complex interplay of patience, vulnerability, and resolve. Confrontation, when approached thoughtfully, is not a threat, but a pathway to deeper understanding. The lessons were subtle yet profound. Listen more than speak, acknowledge without defensiveness, and embrace discomfort as a catalyst for growth. I realized that every challenging interaction carried the potential for personal development and relational repair, provided it was met with integrity and intentionality. The evening after the family meeting, I couldn't shake a sense of anticipation that something pivotal was about to happen. The earlier conversation had cleared some tension, but beneath the surface, currents of unresolved emotions still ran deep. I sat quietly in the living room, watching the light fade across familiar walls, thinking about every word spoken and every glance exchanged. There was a heaviness in the air, but it carried potential a possibility that the truth long avoided would finally surface. Later that night, a text arrived from my daughter. Her words were unusually brief, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. She asked if we could talk in private, without anyone else present. My pulse quickened, not from anxiety alone, but from the recognition that this was the moment when hidden layers of family dynamics might finally be revealed. I responded affirmatively, careful to convey openness without anticipation, wanting to remain calm despite the rush of thoughts in my mind. We met the next afternoon at a quiet cafe, a neutral space far removed from the familiarity of home. The atmosphere was tense but measured, each of us aware that what we were about to discuss could shift everything. She began cautiously, recounting small incidents that, at first glance, seemed insignificant, but together formed a pattern I had long suspected. There were miscommunications, exclusions, and subtle acts of withholding that had eroded trust over time. I listened without interruption, letting her words sink in, feeling both a pang of hurt and a glimmer of relief that at last, someone was acknowledging what had been hidden for years. As the conversation deepened, she revealed a larger issue, one that I had never fully anticipated. Decisions had been made behind my back regarding family finances and living arrangements, and while no malice was intended, the exclusion was unmistakable. I felt a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and frustration. Yet, I reminded myself to stay composed, to process each revelation with clarity rather than defensiveness. I asked questions, gently probing for the reasoning behind these choices, while carefully avoiding assigning blame. This approach allowed us to explore difficult topics without escalating into confrontation. There was a moment when she paused, her hands resting on the table, and the silence between us became almost tangible. I could see her struggle with emotions she had likely suppressed for years. In that stillness, I realized that our roles were not simply parent and child, but partners in untangling a complex history of misunderstanding and unspoken expectations. I shared my perspective, recounting my own experiences of feeling sidelined, overlooked, and misunderstood. I spoke candidly about how those experiences shaped my responses and decisions, and I emphasized my desire for transparency moving forward. The discussion shifted toward reconciliation and practical solutions. We mapped out boundaries, communication strategies, and ways to involve each other in decisions that affected both of us. There were moments of tension, as old habits of defensiveness and pride surfaced, but each time, we returned to the shared goal of rebuilding trust. I felt a deep sense of responsibility to model patience and empathy, knowing that genuine reconciliation requires time, effort, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Unexpectedly, she revealed a personal struggle she had been managing quietly, one that shed new light on some of her earlier actions and decisions. It was a vulnerability that I hadn't anticipated, and it transformed the emotional tenor of our conversation. My initial shock gave way to compassion, and we both acknowledged the strength it took to be honest after years of protective silence. This revelation also allowed me to reconsider past judgments and approach our relationship with a renewed sense of understanding and respect. By the time we left the cafe, hours had passed unnoticed. The streets were dimly lit, and a gentle breeze carried a sense of quiet renewal. We walked together for a few blocks, speaking intermittently, our conversation lighter yet imbued with a newfound sincerity. There was still work to be done, but the barriers that had separated us were beginning to shift. I realized that the journey of rebuilding trust was ongoing, requiring persistence, transparency, and courage from both sides. Returning home, I reflected on the lessons of the day. Emotional estrangement and family conflict are rarely simple. They are layered, complicated by history, misunderstandings, and deeply held expectations. Yet, confronting these issues openly, listening without judgment, and embracing vulnerability can create paths toward healing that were previously unimaginable. I understood more clearly than ever that patience, empathy, and consistent communication are essential to sustaining relationships that have endured strain. As night fell, I felt a cautious optimism I hadn't experienced in years. The revelations of the day had not only clarified long-standing issues, but also opened doors to meaningful dialogue and mutual respect. I acknowledged that while complete resolution would take time, the foundation was being laid for a healthier, more honest connection. The events of Part 9 had emphasized that confronting hidden truths, though often uncomfortable and painful, is necessary for growth, understanding, and emotional reconciliation. The next morning, I woke with a strange mixture of exhaustion and anticipation, the weight of the past days pressing gently on my chest. I knew today would mark a turning point, not because I expected miracles, but because the conversations, the revelations, and the silent admissions had created an opening that could not be ignored. I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring out at the soft morning light filtering through the trees. Each bird call, each distant sound of life in motion, seemed louder and more urgent than usual, as if the world itself were nudging me toward clarity. As I prepared to visit my daughter again, I replayed the previous meeting in my mind. I reflected on her words, her hesitations, and the vulnerability she had shown. I thought about the responsibility I carried not just as a mother, but as a human being trying to navigate the complexities of forgiveness, understanding, and love. Every step I took felt deliberate, purposeful, yet tinged with a sense of uncertainty. What I did know was that this day required courage, honesty, and patience. I could not let fear or pride dictate my actions. When I arrived, her expression betrayed a mixture of relief and anxiety. We greeted each other with a quiet acknowledgement that words alone could not convey. We settled into the living room, a space that had witnessed so many unspoken tensions, yet today felt like a neutral ground. The atmosphere was charged with potential, a sense that the next conversation could either solidify our progress or undo it entirely. I took a deep breath and let the moment stretch, allowing both of us to acclimate to the gravity of what was about to unfold. She began by sharing a memory from her childhood, a moment that had shaped her understanding of family loyalty and responsibility. I listened intently, realizing that beneath the surface of our disagreements were layers of fear, miscommunication, and unmet needs that had gone unacknowledged for years. I felt empathy rising within me, mingled with sadness for the misunderstandings that had kept us apart. Her honesty opened the door for my own confessions, and I spoke about my intentions, my disappointments, and the ways in which I had failed to communicate clearly. The exchange was raw, yet tender, like two dancers learning to move in sync after years of missteps. As the hours passed, we tackled the lingering issues with methodical patience. Discussions that might have escalated into argument in the past were now approached with curiosity and reflection. We examined assumptions, clarified intentions, and acknowledged the mistakes that had caused friction. Every revelation, every hesitant admission, seemed to chip away at the walls we had built around ourselves. It was slow work, but meaningful, each step forward carrying the weight of accumulated years and untold stories. At one point, she shared a decision she had recently made that affected both of us, a choice I had not been included in. There was an initial flash of frustration, a reflexive impulse to protest. But instead of reacting defensively, I listened, asked questions, and sought to understand the reasoning behind her actions. In doing so, I discovered nuances I had not considered, and what first appeared as exclusion turned out to be a decision made out of concern, though misguided in execution. I felt a sense of relief tempered with humility, recognizing that reconciliation often requires holding space for perspectives we might initially resist. The afternoon gave way to evening, and as the light softened, our conversation shifted toward the future. We explored ways to strengthen communication, establish boundaries, and nurture the trust that had been fractured. We spoke about shared experiences, plans, and hopes, allowing ourselves to imagine a relationship not defined by past grievances, but by the potential for growth and mutual respect. There were moments of laughter, brief flashes of old familiarity that reminded me of the bond we had always shared beneath the surface of conflict. Unexpectedly, she revealed a personal project she had been developing quietly, one intended to honor our family history while also addressing unresolved issues. It was thoughtful and reflective, a gesture that required courage and vision. I recognized the symbolism immediately, understanding that this act was her way of bridging the gap between the past and the present, and offering an olive branch of sorts. I responded with appreciation and curiosity, feeling a renewed sense of connection and shared purpose. By the end of the day, the tension that had once defined our interactions had dissipated, replaced by a tentative but sincere sense of reconciliation. We had navigated treacherous emotional terrain, confronted uncomfortable truths, and emerged with a deeper understanding of each other. The journey was far from over, but the foundation for trust and honest dialogue was firmly in place. I realized that healing is not instantaneous, but incremental, built through repeated acts of listening, honesty, and vulnerability. As I returned home that evening, I felt a quiet satisfaction mingled with cautious optimism. The past could not be erased, nor could every hurt be undone, but the path forward was clearer than it had ever been. I understood that family, with all its imperfections and complexities, is not about perfection but about persistence, empathy, and commitment to one another. The events of this final chapter underscored the transformative power of confronting hidden truths, embracing vulnerability, and choosing connection over division. Sitting by the window once more, I reflected on the journey. Each conversation, revelation, and emotional risk had led to this moment of understanding. I felt gratitude for the courage my daughter had shown, and for my own willingness to face discomfort in pursuit of resolution. The story that began with exclusion and uncertainty had, through honesty and patience, evolved into a narrative of reconciliation, clarity, and hope. It was not an ending, but a meaningful beginning, a chance to redefine the bonds that matter most, to nurture them with awareness, empathy, and love. Even as I walked away that night, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and clarity. Their words had cut deep, yet for the first time in years, I realized I didn't need their approval to honor my own worth. I thought about the quiet mornings spent baking, the countless stories I had shared, and the little traditions I had nurtured over decades. These were not erased by a passing remark or a moment of rejection. In that silence, I discovered resilience I hadn't acknowledged before, a quiet dignity that belonged entirely to me. Sometimes, the world will try to dim your light, but it cannot take away the warmth you carry within. I knew I could still celebrate, still find joy, and still create moments of love even if it meant doing it on my own terms. And just as I embraced that, I stumbled upon something that reminded me how family and forgiveness can take the most unexpected shapes. There's a story I want to share next, one where hope and reckoning collide in ways you won't anticipate. If you've ever felt sidelined or overlooked by the people you love, this next chapter will resonate deeply. Keep watching because the next part of this journey might just change the way you see family entirely.